The lonely blacksmith. The hammer fell with a dull thud, echoing in the cavernous forge. Barnaby's stone hand wiped sweat from his brow, with a forearm blackened by soot. Another horseshoe, another coin in the dwindling pile. Each strike was a testament to his strength, his skill, his utter solitude. He tossed the finished shoe onto a growing heap, the metallic clang a mocking applause in the emptiness. He hadn't always been alone. There had been a time, a lifetime ago it seemed, when laughter bounced off these stone walls, when the smell of baking bread mingled with the acrid tang of coal smoke. But that was before the sickness took his mother, before his father followed soon after, broken by grief and age. Now, only the rhythmic pounding of his hammer filled the void. He heaved a sigh that rattled in his chest, a sound as rough and worn as the leather apron he wore. The fire in the hearth crackled, a hungry beast demanding more fuel. Barnaby reluctantly obliged, tossing in a fresh log. The flames licked eagerly, casting dancing shadows that exaggerated the lines etched deep into his face. Lines of toil, of worry, and of a loneliness so profound it had become a physical ache. He glanced towards a small window, the late afternoon sun painting the dust motes dancing in the air a shimmering gold. Beyond the grimy glass, he could just make out the overgrown patch he stubbornly referred to as a garden. Once, his mother had coaxed life from the unforgiving soil, a riot of color and fragrance. Now, it was a tangle of weeds and neglect, mirroring the barren landscape of his own heart. He needed a change. He needed something. The thought had been brewing for months, a slow simmer beneath the surface of his gruff exterior. He'd pushed it down, dismissed it as foolishness, a weakness he couldn't afford. But the loneliness gnawed. He crossed to a rough-hewn table tucked in a corner, the wood scarred and stained from years of use. A quill lay beside a pot of ink, waiting. He hadn't written anything besides receipts and orders in years. The quill felt awkward in his calloused hand. He dipped it in the ink, the nib scratching against the parchment as he began to write. The words came slowly, haltingly, each one a small admission of a need he'd long denied. To Mistress Agnes, matchmaker of Oakhaven, he wrote, his brow furrowed in concentration. I, Barnaby Stonehand, blacksmith of this village, am seeking a wife. He paused, chewing on his lip. How to describe what he wanted? Not wanted, needed. The word felt too soft, too demanding. He wasn't looking for love, not exactly. He was looking for a partner, a companion, someone to share the silence with. He continued, detailing his requirements, the list growing longer and more specific with each line. She must be strong, capable of hard work. Housekeeping skills are essential. Must be able to cook. Good with animals. Obedient. Frugal. He hesitated, then added, almost as an afterthought, and not afraid of a little dirt. He finished the letter, rereading it with a critical eye. It sounded harsh, demanding, but he couldn't soften it. He couldn't risk appearing weak or foolish. He was a blacksmith, not a poet. He sealed the letter with a blob of wax, pressing his thumbprint into it. Then, he turned to the heavy wooden chest beneath the table. He unlocked it with a key he wore on a leather cord around his neck. Inside, nestled amongst old ledgers and tarnished tools, lay his savings. A meager pile of silver and copper coins, the result of years of back-breaking labor. He counted them carefully, his fingers tracing the worn edges of each coin. Enough, he hoped. Enough to secure a wife, to buy a little bit of happiness. Or, at least, to buy an end to the silence. He took a portion of the coins, wrapped them in a piece of cloth, and tied it securely. He added this packet to the letter. The matchmaker wouldn't work for free, after all, and he needed to make a good impression. He walked to the door, the letter and the coins heavy in his hand. As he stepped out into the fading light, he glanced back at the forge, at the empty space beside the hearth. It felt colder than usual tonight. He closed the door behind him, the sound echoing in the gathering dusk. He trudged down the dirt path towards the village, the weight of his loneliness pressing down on him with each step. He paid for a bride. He had to believe his loneliness would soon be over. The matchmaker better deliver. An unexpected arrival. The midday sun beat down on the dusty track leading to Barnaby's forge, each ray a hammer blow against his already fraying patience. He wiped a grimy hand across his brow, the familiar grit of coal dust doing little to soothe his irritation. He told the matchmaker midday. Midday meant midday, not some nebulous stretch of time dictated by the whims of slow-footed travelers. He spat on the ground, the sound swallowed by the vast emptiness surrounding his isolated home. He'd envisioned this moment 1,000 times, each version featuring a strong, capable woman striding confidently towards him, her gaze firm, her hands calloused. A woman who wouldn't balk at the heat of the forge, who understood the value of hard work, who wouldn't need coddling. Barnaby adjusted the worn leather apron tied around his waist. The small chest containing the promised dowry sat heavy on the workbench inside. Not much, but enough to entice a woman desperate enough to answer his specific advertisement. A flicker of movement in the distance caught his eye. A figure, small and indistinct, slowly making its way along the road. Barnaby straightened, his shoulders squaring involuntarily. This was it. As the figure drew closer, his initial anticipation began to curdle into disbelief. This couldn't be her. The woman approaching his forge was slight, almost fragile, with a hesitant gait that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. She wore a simple, pale blue dress, travel-stained and creased, and carried a small, worn satchel slung over her shoulder. Her head was bowed, her face obscured by a cascade of light brown hair that seemed determined to hide her from the world. She stopped a few feet away from him, her gaze fixed on the dusty ground. Barnaby remained silent, waiting for her to speak, but she seemed rooted to the spot, as if bracing herself for a blow. Finally, she took a shaky breath and lifted her head. Her eyes, large and the color of rain-washed violets, widened slightly as they met his. They were intelligent eyes, filled with a quiet sadness that made Barnaby inexplicably uncomfortable. "Barnaby Stone-and?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He grunted in acknowledgement. "You're Alara Metasweet?" She nodded, her fingers tightening around the strap of her satchel. "Yes." Barnaby felt a surge of disappointment, so profound it threatened to overwhelm him. This was not the sturdy helpmate he'd envisioned. This was a girl, a waif. She looked more like she belonged in a library than a blacksmith's forge. He ran a calloused hand through his thinning hair. "The matchmaker said," he trailed off, unsure how to articulate his dissatisfaction without sounding like a complete brute. "She said you were looking for a wife," Alara finished softly, her gaze unwavering. "Aye," Barnaby said, his voice gruff. "A strong woman. Someone capable. Someone who can handle things." He gestured vaguely towards the forge, the anvil, the heavy tools scattered around the yard. Alara's gaze followed his gesture, then returned to his face. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, perhaps understanding, perhaps defiance, but it vanished so quickly he couldn't be sure. I may not be strong in the way you expect," she said, her voice gaining a touch of firmness. "But I am capable, and I am willing to learn." Barnaby snorted. "Learn? You look like you'd faint at the sight of a hammer." A faint blush crept up Alara's cheeks, but she held her ground. "Perhaps, but I'm a quick study, and I'm not afraid of hard work." He studied her more closely, searching for any sign of the strength he so desperately craved. But all he saw was a gentle face, framed by soft hair, and eyes that seemed to hold a universe of unspoken thoughts. He saw vulnerability, intelligence, and a quiet determination that both intrigued and irritated him. This was a mistake. The matchmaker had clearly taken advantage of his desperation. He'd been swindled. "Come inside," he said abruptly, turning towards the forge. "Let's see if you can even lift a bucket of water." Alara followed him, her small figure swallowed by the imposing shadow of the forge. As she crossed the threshold, she paused, her gaze sweeping over the interior with an almost reverent expression. Barnaby watched her, his disappointment hardening into something akin to resentment. He'd paid for a strong back and a willing spirit. He'd received this. Forge follies. Right then, Barnaby boomed, the sound echoing in the already cacophonous forge. He stood before Alara, a mountain of a man next to a slender sapling. First, you learn to respect the fire. It gives life to the metal, but it bites if you're careless. Alara, her eyes wide, nodded, clutching the edges of her borrowed apron. It dwarfed her, nearly tripping her as she took a tentative step closer to the hearth. The heat washed over her face, a palpable force that made her skin prickle. Barnaby gestured towards the bellows. Pump those. Steady, even pressure. Not too fast, not too slow. Like breathing. He demonstrated with exaggerated movements, his powerful arms compressing the leather with practiced ease. Alara mimicked his actions, but her smaller frame struggled with the weight. The bellows wheezed and sputtered, sending erratic puffs of air into the fire. Embers popped and danced, one landing precariously close to a stack of wood. Easy, Barnaby barked, striding over to stomp out the errant spark. You'll burn the place down before you even learn to swing a hammer. He adjusted her stance, his hands briefly touching her back. Alara flinched at the contact, her cheeks flushing a deeper shade of pink. After several attempts, Alara managed a somewhat more consistent airflow. The fire roared to life, casting flickering shadows that danced on the forge walls. Barnaby grunted, a sound that might have been grudging approval. Next came the tongs. He showed her how to grip a piece of iron, the metal glowing orange with heat. Hold it firm. Don't be afraid. It's the fear that makes you clumsy. Alara swallowed, her knuckles white as she grasped the tongs. The iron felt impossibly heavy, pulling at her arm. She stumbled slightly, nearly dropping it into the water trough. Blast it, woman! Barnaby swore, snatching the tongs away. You'll scald yourself. Here, watch me. He expertly maneuvered the iron, placing it on the anvil with a ringing clang. Now the hammer. He handed her a small hammer, much lighter than the one he usually used. Start slow. Gentle taps. Feel the metal move. Alara swung. Her aim was off, and the hammer struck the anvil with a dull thud, missing the iron entirely. She tried again, this time connecting with the metal, but the blow was weak and ineffective. The iron remained stubbornly unchanged. Barnaby sighed, the sound like air escaping a punctured bellows. You're hitting it like you're swatting a fly. Put some muscle into it. Alara gritted her teeth and swung again, putting all her weight behind the blow. This time, the hammer connected with the iron with a resounding clang. But instead of bending smoothly, the metal buckled and twisted into a bizarre, contorted shape that resembled a mangled pretzel. Barnaby stared at the misshapen metal, his face slowly turning crimson. What in the name of the gods did you do to that? Alara, her chest heaving, simply shrugged, her eyes downcast. I don't know. He snatched the iron from her grasp and tossed it back into the fire. Right. That's enough for today. Go. Go sweep the floor or something. Just stay away from the fire. Alara, relieved to be dismissed, quickly untied the apron and retreated to a corner of the forge. As she swept, she glanced back at Barnaby. He was staring into the fire, his brow furrowed, muttering to himself. She couldn't quite make out the words, but she distinctly heard the phrase, expensive mistake. The day continued in a similar vein. Alara's attempts to learn were met with a series of comical disasters. She nearly extinguished the fire with too much water. She sent a shower of sparks flying when she dropped a piece of coal, and she managed to bend another piece of iron into an even more improbable shape. This one vaguely resembled a wilted flower. By the end of the day, Barnaby was a broken man. His initial disappointment had morphed into exasperation, and then, finally, into a kind of weary resignation. He slumped onto a stool, his face buried in his hands. Alara, covered in soot and grime, stood awkwardly before him. I'm sorry, she said softly. I know I'm not very good at this. Barnaby didn't look up. That's an understatement. But I'm willing to learn, she continued, her voice gaining strength. If you're willing to teach me. He finally raised his head, his eyes meeting hers. He saw not the fragile, useless woman he had initially perceived, but something else, a spark of determination, a a quiet resilience that belied her delicate appearance. "Learn," he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "At this rate, you'll bankrupt me before you learn a hammer and nail straight." But something had shifted. The resentment was still there, but it was tempered with a reluctant respect, and perhaps, just perhaps, a flicker of something akin to hope. A garden's grace. The clang of Barnaby's hammer faded as Alara escaped the stifling heat of the forge. Each day was a trial by fire, literally and figuratively. Barnaby's gruff pronouncements and barely contained sighs were a constant reminder of her inadequacy. She longed for the quiet peace of the meadows she'd left behind, the gentle sway of wildflowers in the breeze. Her gaze drifted past the dusty windows of Barnaby's cottage and landed on the patch of earth outside. It wasn't a garden, not anymore. Weeds choked out any semblance of order, their thorny tendrils reaching hungrily across the barren soil. A few skeletal stalks hinted at a forgotten harvest, long past their prime. That night, after a supper of burnt stew that Barnaby ate with grim satisfaction, Alara spoke. "Barnaby, may I tend the garden?" He grunted, scraping his bowl. "Garden's dead. Waste of time. But perhaps it could be revived?" Alara ventured, her voice barely a whisper. Barnaby shrugged, the movement dismissive. "Do what you want. Just don't expect miracles." The next morning, before the sun fully crested the horizon, Alara was outside. She wore a simple linen dress, its fabric thin from travel, and her hands, still raw from the forge, trembled slightly as she grasped a rusty trowel. The earth was hard and unforgiving, but she persevered, pulling weeds with surprising strength. Hours passed, and slowly, painstakingly, she cleared a small patch of ground. She walked to the village square, her cheeks flushed with exertion. Hesitantly, she approached a stall overflowing with seedlings, vibrant greens, delicate blossoms, and promising vegetables. She bartered a small silver brooch, a memento from her mother, for a handful of seeds and a few young plants. The vendor, a plump woman with kind eyes, watched her with curiosity. Back at the cottage, Alara planted the seeds and seedlings with meticulous care, whispering encouragements to each tiny sprout. She gathered water from the well, carrying bucket after heavy bucket, her slight frame straining under the weight. Barnaby watched her from the forge doorway, his expression unreadable. He didn't offer to help, didn't offer a word of encouragement, but he didn't stop her either. Days turned into weeks. Alara spent every spare moment in the garden, coaxing life back into the neglected soil. She watered, weeded, and nurtured the plants with a gentle touch. Slowly, a transformation began to unfold. First came the green shoots, pushing their way through the earth. Then came the delicate blossoms, splashes of vibrant color against the drab landscape. Soon, vegetables began to ripen. Plump tomatoes, crisp lettuce, and vibrant carrots. The air filled with the sweet scent of herbs and blooming flowers. The villagers noticed. They stopped to admire the colorful display, their faces lighting up with smiles. "It's beautiful," they exclaimed. "You brought life back to this place." One afternoon, a group of children gathered at the edge of the garden, their eyes wide with wonder. Alara, her face streaked with dirt, offered them a handful of ripe strawberries. Their laughter filled the air, a sweet melody that reached even Barnaby's ears in the forge. Even a plump vendor from the market came to visit. "You have a gift," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "A true green thumb." She pressed a packet of rare flower seeds into Alara's hand. "These are moon petal blooms. They only open at night, under the moonlight. They'll bring beauty even in the darkness." Barnaby remained aloof, but Alara noticed him watching the garden, a flicker of something akin to curiosity in his eyes. One evening, he emerged from the forge, his hands blackened with soot. He stood at the edge of the garden, his gaze sweeping over the vibrant colors. "What are you going to do with all that?" he asked, his voice gruff. "Share it," Alara replied simply. "Share the beauty, share the food." And she did. She offered baskets of vegetables to the elderly and the needy. She gave bouquets of flowers to the sick and the lonely. Her kindness spread through the village like the fragrance of her garden, touching hearts and bringing smiles to faces. One night, under the silvery glow of the moon petal blooms unfurled, their delicate petals shimmering like captured starlight. Alara sat in the garden, surrounded by their ethereal beauty. Barnaby stood in the doorway of the cottage, a silhouette against the warm light within. He didn't speak, but Alara knew he was watching. And in that moment, she felt a flicker of hope, a sense that perhaps, even in this harsh and unfamiliar place, she could find a way to bloom. Whispers of change. The morning sun, no longer obscured by the overgrown weeds that had plagued the cottage garden, spilled across Alara's face as she snipped moon petal blooms. Their silvery light caught in her hair, turning the strands into shimmering threads. Barnaby watched her from the forge doorway, the rhythmic clang of his hammer silenced for a moment. He still couldn't quite reconcile the delicate creature with the image he'd held of a blacksmith's wife, a woman built of muscle and grit, not moonbeams and flower petals. Alara gathered the cut stems into a woven basket, the scent of the moon petals filling the air. She turned, offering him a shy smile. "For the village," she said, her voice barely a whisper against the morning breeze. Barnaby grunted, turning back to his work. "They'll only wilt and die." But Alara didn't seem to hear him. She set off towards the village, the basket swinging gently at her side. He watched, a scowl etched on his face, as she approached Widow Agnes, offering her a single, perfect bloom. The old woman's face crinkled into a smile, a rare sight, and she tucked the flower into her shawl with trembling hands. Then Alara moved on, distributing the blossoms to the baker, the miller, even grumpy old Thomas, who usually chased children from his doorstep. Each interaction was met with a hesitant smile, a softened gaze. It was as if she were weaving kindness into the very fabric of the village. Back in the forge, Barnaby hammered at a stubborn piece of iron, the rhythmic clang echoing his inner turmoil. He wanted to dismiss her efforts as frivolous, a waste of time. But he couldn't deny the subtle shift in the village's atmosphere. There was a lightness, a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. He returned to the cottage for midday meal, expecting the usual chaos. Instead, he found the table neatly set, the floor swept clean, and a steaming bowl of stew waiting for him. He blinked, surprised. He hadn't realized how accustomed he'd become to the clutter, the dust, the general disarray that had always been a constant in his life. He ate in silence, the stew surprisingly flavorful, a medley of herbs he couldn't quite place. "Did you need anything else, Barnaby?" Alara asked, her voice soft. He grunted again, pushing the empty bowl away. "Learn to swing a hammer," he muttered, stalking back to the forge. The days that followed fell into a similar pattern. Alara tended her garden, shared its bounty with the village, and kept the cottage surprisingly tidy. Barnaby continued his work, his initial resentment slowly giving way to a grudging acceptance. He still grumbled about her lack of blacksmithing skills, but his words lacked their former bite. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Barnaby found himself leaning against the doorway of the forge, watching Alara as she spoke with a group of children gathered around the garden. She was telling them a story, her voice animated, her eyes sparkling. The children listened, captivated, their faces lit by the soft glow of the moon petals. He saw young Millie, who'd always been timid and withdrawn, reach out and gently touch Alara's hand. A slow smile spread across Barnaby's face, a smile he quickly suppressed when Alara glanced in his direction. He straightened up, cleared his throat, and disappeared back into the forge, the clang of his hammer filling the evening air. But the image of Alara surrounded by the children, bathed in the ethereal light of the moon petals, lingered in his mind long after the last spark faded from the fire. The whispers of change, carried on the evening breeze, were becoming harder to ignore. The storm. The wind shrieked, a banshee wail that scraped against Barnaby's raw nerves. Rain hammered the forge's stout walls, each blow a savage reminder of nature's unbridled power. He'd known tempests before, tucked as he was within the dragon's tooth mountain's shadowed embrace. But this felt different, imbued with a predatory hunger. He watched Alara, her face a porcelain mask in the hearth's glow. She fought to repair a rent in the shutter, her normally deft fingers working with a desperate haste. A prickle of guilt surfaced within him. He should be fortifying their sanctuary, not leaving it to her. Yet, he stood frozen, a coil of dread tightening in his stomach. "Barnaby," she called, her voice a fragile thread against the tempest's roar. "The roof. I fear it's giving way." He stirred at last, his boots echoing dully on the floorboards. Seizing his heavy cloak, he made for the ladder to the loft. The old timbers groaned beneath his weight, each protest a testament to the relentless onslaught. Reaching the top, he risked a look through a small, dusty pane. A chill deeper than the storms penetrated him. The village was a maelstrom of driven rain and airborne debris. Roof slates tore loose like scales from a panicked serpent hurled skyward. Trees, veterans of countless seasons, bowed low, their limbs flailing in frantic surrender. He glimpsed Thomas the baker's house, a gaping hole where its roof had been. Alara's fields, her beloved fields coaxed to life from stubborn earth, were now a submerged morass, a swirling sepia of mud and shattered hopes. Barnaby descended, his face etched with worry. "It's dire, Alara. Truly dire." She didn't reply, her eyes reflecting his own mounting fear. He saw the lines of anxiety deepen on her brow. He'd poured his very essence into this land, into crafting a life. Now, nature, in its blind and pitiless fury, threatened to obliterate it all. The storm raged for what felt like an age. Sleep remained a distant dream. Each thunderclap, each gusting screech, was a fresh assault on their strained composure. Barnaby roamed restlessly, anger simmering. He yearned to confront the storm, to unleash his own fury, but he was helpless against its might. As dawn finally clawed its way through the clouds, a weak, diluted light filtered through the downpour. The wind had softened its attack, yet the rain continued its unyielding barrage. Barnaby opened the door, steeling himself against the lingering gusts. The scene before him was one of wholesale destruction. Dwellings lay in ruins, their contents strewn across the ravaged earth. The fields were a mire, the harvest lost. Villagers crawled from their shattered homes, faces blank with shock. Their eyes, hollow and vacant, mirrored the devastation around them. Old man Hemlock, his face streaked with mud, stood transfixed before his ruined garden, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat. Martha, the weaver, wept openly, clutching a sodden scrap of her craft. Even Gareth, the village's powerhouse, appeared diminished, his usual hearty laughter replaced by a hollow silence. Alara moved to his side, her hand finding his. He glanced down, surprised by the strength in her grasp. She was small, yes, seemingly delicate, but a steely resolve burned in her gaze, a spark of defiance that refused to be quenched. "We have to help them, Barnaby," she declared, her voice unwavering despite a slight tremor. "We must do something." He surveyed the wreckage, the faces of his neighbors, and a new emotion stirred within him. It was more than despair. It was a tendril of hope, ignited by Alara's indomitable spirit. He understood the road ahead would be long and fraught with hardship. Rebuilding the village would demand time, labor, and sacrifice. Yet, he also knew they wouldn't face it alone. He squeezed her hand, his gaze hardening with purpose. "You're right," he affirmed, his voice rough but resolute. "We will." Turning towards the villagers, he raised his voice to carry across the ruined landscape. "We've weathered trials before, and we shall overcome this one. We will raise our homes from the wreckage, replant our fields, and we shall do so together. We are Stonehand, and we shall not be broken." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. It was a humble sound, but it was enough. It was the voice of hope, the sound of resilience, the sound of a community refusing to surrender. The storm had taken much, but it had also revealed something, the fortitude that resided deep within them, waiting to be summoned forth. Alara's vision. Barnaby surveyed the wreckage, the familiar knot of despair tightening in his chest. The smithy, his sanctuary, had lost half its roof, the bellows soaked and useless. He kicked a loose stone, the sound swallowed by the general moaning of the wind. He should be hammering, rebuilding, leading. But the sight of the devastation felt like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. Alara stood beside him, seemingly unfazed by the chaos. Her small hands were clasped in front of her, her gaze sweeping across the flattened crops and splintered homes. She didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. Instead, she said, her voice clear and steady, "We need to build smarter, Barnaby." He scoffed, the sound harsh even to his own ears. Smarter? The storm tore through stone like parchment. What smarter is going to stop that? Alara didn't flinch. Arched roofs, she said, pointing towards the few structures that had weathered the storm with minimal damage. The old stone bridge, the root cellar. They distribute weight more evenly. And deeper foundations, reinforced with interwoven branches. I read about it in a book on Roman architecture. Barnaby stared at her, suspicion warring with a grudging curiosity. Roman architecture? What did a slip of a woman like her know about building? He'd spent his life working with stone and iron, using methods passed down through generations. Yet the bridge had stood firm. Branches? You want to build houses out of twigs. He couldn't quite keep the derision from his voice. Not twigs, Barnaby. Strong, supple branches woven tightly together, packed with clay and straw. It creates a flexible framework that can withstand wind and tremors. It's called wattle and daub. It's lighter than stone, easier to repair, and surprisingly strong. She met his gaze, her expression earnest. I know it sounds unconventional, but we need to adapt. We can't just rebuild what was lost the same way. He considered her words, the image of his father's stern face flashing in his mind. His father, who had scoffed at anything new, anything that deviated from tradition. But his father's house was now a pile of rubble. "Show me," he said, the word rough. Alara led him to a patch of relatively undisturbed earth. She sketched a design in the mud with a stick, a low, sturdy structure with an arched roof and deep foundations. She explained how the wattle and daub would work, demonstrating the weaving pattern with nimble fingers. She spoke of ventilation, of using local materials, of building with the landscape, not against it. Slowly, Barnaby began to see. It wasn't magic, it was ingenuity. Practical, informed ingenuity. He called a meeting in the town square, or what was left of it. The villagers, faces etched with exhaustion and despair, listened in silence as Barnaby, with Alara at his side, outlined the new building plan. There were murmurs of doubt, of resistance to change. "It's different," Old Man Hemlock croaked, his voice raspy. "We've always built with stone." "Stone failed us," Barnaby countered, his voice firm. "Alara has shown me a better way, a stronger way, and I know how to make it work." He looked at Alara, a flicker of something akin to gratitude passing between them. "We'll still use stone for the foundations, for the hearths, but we'll reinforce it, protect it, and we'll build together." He picked up a fallen branch and began to demonstrate the weaving technique. Slowly, hesitantly, others joined him. A woman showed him how to mix the clay and straw to the right consistency. A young boy volunteered to gather more branches. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ravaged landscape, the villagers worked side by side, their initial reluctance giving way to a shared purpose. Barnaby, the blacksmith, used his strength and skill to shape the stone foundations, his movements precise and efficient. Alara, the scholar, guided the weaving of the wattle and daub, her voice a calming presence amidst the chaos. The air filled with the rhythmic thud of hammers, the rustling of branches, the murmur of voices. It wasn't just a village being rebuilt, Barnaby realized. It was a community finding its strength, guided by a woman he had initially dismissed as weak, and led by a vision born not of brute force, but of knowledge and resilience. He realized with a jolt that Alara was not a burden, but a catalyst transforming not just the village, but him as well. The despair that had gripped him earlier began to dissipate, replaced by a spark of hope, fueled by the sight of his neighbors working together, building something new, something stronger, under Alara's quiet, unwavering guidance. The merchant's offer. A plume of dust trailed behind the merchant's flamboyant conveyance, a stark counterpoint to the village square's pristine cobblestones. Gone was the all-conquering mud, replaced by meticulously crafted pathways, their borders defined by Alara's cunningly angled drainage, diverting rain away from the resurrected homes. Barnaby watched it approach, a cold fist clenching in his gut. The merchant's emblem, a gilded goose atop a wool sack, a symbol of prosperity that always felt both unattainable and faintly repellent. Silas, a stout man with a ferret's sharp features, descended, lackeys scrambling to spread a silken rug under his boots. His gaze roved over the village, pausing at the robust, terracotta roofs of the rebuilt dwellings, sunlight dancing on the ingenious Roman arches Alara had championed. "Remarkable," Silas pronounced, his voice unexpectedly reedy. He advanced towards Barnaby, who stood awkwardly by the nascent frame of his smithy, its walls already proclaiming the resilience of Alara's brickwork. "I've heard tell of this blossoming. Astounding what innovation can accomplish." His gloved fingers stroked a nearby brick's smooth, cool surface. "And who, may I ask, is the architect of this transformation?" Barnaby indicated Alara, who oversaw the placement of a lintel on widow Agnes's cottage. "My wife, Alara." Silas's eyes widened, seemingly noticing her for the first time, his focus previously glued to the buildings. He offered a theatrical bow, his silk robes whispering like dried leaves. "My dear woman, you possess a rare gift, a veritable visionary. I've traversed continents, witnessed the most opulent cities, and I confess, I've never encountered such practical poetry." Alara, unfazed by the gushing praise, offered a simple smile. "Thank you, Master Silas. We merely sought to build something that could weather the seasons." Silas chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Seasons will change, my dear, but genius like yours is a far rarer commodity. Tell me, have you considered deploying your talents beyond this humble hamlet?" A flicker of hesitation crossed Alara's face. "I am content here, Master Silas." The merchant's gaze flicked back to Barnaby, assessing him with a canny glint that made the blacksmith's hackles rise. "Your wife is a marvel, Stonehand, a veritable wellspring of invention. I can see she's wasted in this provincial backwater." He paused, lowering his voice in a conspiratorial manner. "Tell you what, I require someone with her to supervise the construction of a new trading post in Oakhaven. A profitable enterprise, I assure you. I'm prepared to make you a generous proposal for her expertise. And, given your recent misfortunes," he let the phrase hang, the implication ringing loud. Barnaby felt a glacial chill seep into his bones. The offer wasn't about employment. It was about ownership, trading Alara like chattel, like a possession. He fought to swallow, his throat constricted. He glanced at Alara, her expression now an inscrutable mask. The memory of their life before the storm resurfaced, his bitterness, the stifling sense of being confined. Had he not, in his darkest moments, seen her as a burden? A pretty face without the grit to handle a hammer? Silas pressed on, oblivious to the internal struggle. 500 gold pieces, Stonehand. A sum that would reconstruct your smithy tenfold. A sum that would ensure your security for years to come. Consider the prospects this would afford you. 500 gold pieces. A fortune beyond his wildest imaginings. He could rebuild bigger and better. By the finest tools, hire journeymen. Emerge from his father's long shadow. Prove his mettle at last. But at what sacrifice? He met Alara's gaze. He saw not the delicate woman he'd once misjudged, but the sinew in her hands as she set bricks, the spark in her eyes as she elucidated Roman engineering principles, the resolute spirit that had spurred an entire village to rise from ruin. He saw the quiet tenderness with which she'd tended his wounds, both physical and emotional, after the tempest. He saw, perhaps for the first time, the fortitude of her soul. The silence stretched, taut and suffocating. Silas fidgeted, his ferret eyes gleaming with avarice. The villagers ceased their labors, sensing the charged atmosphere, their gazes fixed on Barnaby. Finally, Barnaby found his voice, a guttural rumble that surprised even him. "She is not for sale. A change of heart." "Absolutely not, Silas," Barnaby rasped, his refusal a jagged edge in the afternoon air. The merchant's previously beaming, acquisitive expression soured. "No, but consider the possibilities, Stonehand. The wealth. Enough to reconstruct your forge a dozen times, a life free from toil." Silas gestured emphatically, his rings catching the sunlight. He reeked of exotic perfumes and rich brocades, a world apart from Barnaby's ingrained sweat and grime. Barnaby's fist tightened. The images Silas conjured were beguiling, a seductive promise of ease. But as his gaze fell on Alara, standing silently at his side, her face an enigmatic study, resolve solidified within him. He saw not just a gifted designer, but a woman who had resurrected their shattered community, a woman who had patiently dismantled the fortress around his emotions. "She's not an object to be traded," Barnaby declared, each word a forceful impact. "Alara is neither chattel nor a template to be duplicated. She is my partner." Silas snorted, a dismissive sound that frayed Barnaby's temper. "Partner? A woman? Don't be ridiculous. She's your wife. You command her abilities, her output. That's simply the established order." Fury, immediate and intense, bloomed in Barnaby's core. "She commands herself, Silas, and chooses to share her life, her talents, with me. I have no dominion to barter something that is inherently hers." He turned to Alara, his tone gentler, yet still bearing its inherent roughness. "It was foolish of me to entertain the notion, to even contemplate selling something so invaluable." Alara's gaze softened, a spark of warmth igniting within. A heavy, quiet descended, thick with unspoken sentiments. Barnaby felt a trickle of perspiration snake down his temple, his pulse a frantic drum against his ribs. Words had always failed him. He'd never been able to articulate the complex emotions roiling within. But he had to try. He moved towards her, his work-worn hand extending hesitantly. "Alara," he began, his voice thick with regret. I haven't been the husband you deserve. I viewed you as a quick fix, a means to an end. I was oblivious to your strength, your insight, your beauty." He stumbled over the final word, unaccustomed to such declarations. He saw surprise flicker in her eyes, the delicate curve of her mouth. He had never communicated with her like this, never exposed his shortcomings so vulnerably. He had consistently sought refuge behind a facade of brusqueness, fearful of exposing his raw nerves. "I was wrong, Alara," he pressed on, his voice gaining conviction. "So terribly wrong. I don't desire your capabilities to restore Oakhaven. I desire you. I want you to remain here with me as my wife, not due to contractual obligations, but of your own free will." He paused, his heart lodged in his throat. "Please, Alara, grant me forgiveness. Stay with me. Allow us to build a life, not just a village." The air vibrated with expectation. Silas shifted impatiently, but Barnaby scarcely noticed. All his focus was directed at Alara, at the interplay of emotions across her features. He held his breath, waiting, yearning for some indication. Finally, a slow smile illuminated her face, dispelling the shadows that had resided there. "Barnaby," she murmured, her voice a gentle melody. "You possess a peculiar way of showing it, but I think I understand." She reached out and clasped his hand, her fingers weaving with his. Her touch was warm and reassuring, a soothing balm to his wounded spirit. "I arrived here in search of belonging, of purpose," she continued. "I discovered both, not within the infrastructure of the village, but within the soul of the man who shaped it." She squeezed his hand reassuringly. "I will stay, Barnaby, not out of sympathy, not out of indebtedness, but because I desire to, because I believe that together we can create something genuinely remarkable. Relief flooded him, an overwhelming surge that nearly buckled his knees. He returned the pressure of her hand, his heart overflowing with a joy he had never imagined possible. He turned back to Silas, who looked increasingly disgruntled. "You heard her, Silas. She's staying. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a community to manage." Silas scoffed, his face reddening with indignation. "You'll regret this, Stonehand. You'll regret spurning such an opportunity." Barnaby merely shrugged. "Perhaps, but I strongly doubt it." He turned and guided Alara back toward the village, leaving the merchant standing alone in the dusty road, his aspirations of architectural exploitation collapsing around him. The aroma of spices and ambition dissipated on the wind, supplanted by the natural fragrance of wood smoke and blossoming wildflowers. As they walked, Barnaby felt lighter than he had in years, the burden of isolation and remorse finally easing from his shoulders. He had purchased a bride, yes, but in return he gained a woman who had shown him grace, and in doing so had liberated him and their village completely.